youtube.com/openupyourmind101.
Well, when I was a graduate student at the University of Rochester, I was very interested in people's values and goals. And the reason I was interested in that was because I was interested in the question of how people go about trying to construct their lives. There's much in our lives that happen to us that aren't from our own intentions, if you will, but our values and goals are part of what lead us to decide to do X instead of Y, and then lead us to have this experience instead of that experience. And so when I was a young graduate student, I set out to try to understand, well, what are people's different values and goals, and how does that relate to the quality of their life? And materialism actually at that point was just one of a variety of different values and goals that I was studying. I had no, I would say, a special focus on it. But what happened was that I came across the finding rather unexpectedly, that the more that my subjects were reporting that they thought it was very important to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions, actually the less happy they were. They were reporting more depression, more anxiety, less feelings of vitality and aliveness and such like that. The more that I began to think about it and understand this finding that materialism was bad for people's well-being, the more it struck me as very interesting, given the society that we live in, which continually tells us that the way to happiness is to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions. So it's been a very, rich ground for me to plow, if you will, as I've been a psychologist and continued to do research.
What does your discipline tell you about what it means to be human?
I think that humans have this very strong growth tendency within them, like all living things do. And, we're going to grow into something different than an acorn grows into, obviously. But like an acorn and like all other living things, there's this very basic motivation to grow, to be who we're going to be, to actualize ourselves, to use the terms of Maslow and Rogers. When people have the opportunity to grow and to express themselves and to follow their own interests, the vast majority of those individuals are going to end up functioning pretty well in the world and are going to function and are going to be fairly pro-social. They're going to be fairly happy and healthy and all of the rest. So on the one hand, there's that very strong growth motive that I think characterizes people. At the same time, I think that all isn't rosy within the human psyche. I think that we have quite a number of different ways in which we act in very selfish ways, in which we're very focused on our short-term survival, on making sure that we aren't too upset by something which might come either from outside or from internally in terms of our urges. I think that evolution has left us with a side of ourselves that can be awfully mean and nasty and self-centered. And I think all we have to do is to take a look at the history of our species, and we'll see very clearly that that side of humans is also fairly predominant. At the same time that we can, as a species, create great works of art and great symphonies and great scientific advances, we also have a pretty strong tendency to kill our fellow humans and to take what we want and not think about others. So I think that both of those tendencies are there in us. We have a really strong, greedy, self-centered, aggressive, competitive side, but we also have a side that can be very creative and can cooperate and can grow and can explore and do all kinds of interesting new things that are beneficial for ourselves and for the world. And I think everyone has always had both of those sets of tendencies. And I'm not saying those are the only tendencies humans have, but they're clearly among them. And I think that, and I know we'll probably talk about this more here, but part of the trick of growing is, or part of what depends which of those tendencies become dominant, it depends upon the environment that people find themselves in, both the maternal and paternal environment, the environment of the family, but also the cultural environment and the broader societal environment. And those environments can either support the movement towards growth, or they can discourage it. They can promote lots of ideas and messages which lead us to be greedy or to be cooperative. And so for me, what it means to be human, I guess, when it all boils down, is to live in environments and to create environments for other people as well, which either support those growth motives or which suppress and discourage them and instead encourage these kind of greedier, more self-centered motives. Well, for me, materialism is when people place a relatively strong importance on goals such as making a lot of money, having a lot of possessions, caring a lot about one's image, which is almost always mediated through possessions, the clothes we wear, the house we own, and also caring a lot about popularity and status, which is oftentimes again mediated through possessions. So it's this cluster of goals, of consumeristic goals, of goals that have to do with what we in our scientific writing oftentimes call extrinsic motives, okay, with rewards, with other people's praise, with trying to appear to other people or to even to ourselves in certain ways. So there's this extrinsic quality to this set of goals, and our research has shown that over the years. But that materialism really boils down to wanting money, wanting possessions, wanting this image that comes through money and possessions, and wanting the status that comes through money and possessions.
Well, we probably don't need to talk about this too much, but how do you see that sort of manifesting itself in the United States?
Well, the United States as a culture is one that we know from our research does a great deal in order to encourage that particular set of values. And, we can come back to this later if you want, but that's sort of necessary to our economic system and our political system to get people to hold those values as relatively important to them. And, the research does show that the U.S. oftentimes scores quite high on measures of materialism compared to other nations in the world. Briefly, what the studies are studies that every year ask about 100,000 incoming freshmen how important various goals are to them, and one of those goals is financial success. And if you take a look at the percentage of those incoming freshmen who say it's very important or essential to be rich and to be financially successful, back in the 1960s or so, the percentage who said it was very important or essential was sort of around 45%. By the mid-1990s, it had climbed up, in 2000 or so, that number had climbed up to around 80 to 85% of incoming freshmen said it was very important or essential to be financially well off. And it sort of has stayed in the low 80s since the low 80% for the last decade or so. It's also important to note, I think, that at the same time that caring about money has gone up over that 50-year time period, the percentage of people who say that it's very important or essential to develop a meaningful philosophy of life has plummeted. And has gone from being in 80% back in the 1960s to around 40% today. So these two seem to act in opposition to each other, which goes back to what I was saying about what it means to be human. The develop a meaningful philosophy of life is part of what that growth actualization process is, and that seems to have been pushed out in people's concern to make a lot of money instead.
So the question is there a possibility of balance? Before getting to that, want to ask you to talk a little bit about what you see as the kind of root causes of this.
Sure. Well, the research that we've done suggests that there are two primary sets of causes for why people end up being more materialistic and endorsing those materialistic goals. The first reason or set of reasons is fairly obvious. It's social modeling. So what the research shows is that the more that people are exposed to messages in their social environment which seem to suggest that materialistic values are important to them, the more they themselves also endorse materialistic values. So we know from several studies that the more materialistic parents are, the more materialistic kids are. We know that mostly with mothers, actually. There's not a lot of data with fathers, but mostly with mothers. We know that the more television that children are exposed to, the more materialistic they are. And of course, television is one of the major sources of materialistic messages. We know that materialistic peers, there's just a little bit of data starting to suggest that the more you have materialistic peers, the more materialistic you yourselves are too. So there's this set of social models which seem to create this desire to have what other people seem to be saying are important. So that's the first set of influences. The second set of influences are what we call psychological insecurity. One of the things we know from the research is that when people are put in situations which make them feel psychologically insecure, they tend to orient towards materialistic values. So, for example, when research studies show that when kids are raised by parents who are more cold and controlling and non-nurturant, they tend to be more materialistic. We know that when kids grow up and their parents get divorced, the kids tend to be more materialistic. We know that growing up in economic insecurity, which of course makes people feel pretty insecure, that those kids are actually more materialistic than kids who have more stability economically. We've done experiments where we ask people to think about being rich or poor. When they think about being poor, they become more materialistic. We've done studies where we ask people to think about their own death versus some neutral topic, and thinking about your own death, which is one of the big insecurities, tends to promote materialistic values too. So those are the two main sets of drivers of materialism, the social modeling and the insecurity. Now, kind of overarching that, we have the social structure that we live in, which is consumer capitalism here in our country. And I think one of the things I've been writing about a lot more over the last 5 years or so has been this idea that consumer capitalism has processes that are about both social modeling of materialism and about creating insecurity. So obviously, under consumer capitalist economies like ours, there's all kinds of messages saying it's important to make a lot of money. We get those messages from advertisements. We get those messages from our political leaders. We get those messages every time somebody says that what's most important is economic growth. Mm-hmm. And then under consumer capitalism, there's all kinds of ways in which people are led to feel insecure. We have a great mobility and the dissolution of family, which is a major source of insecurity. We have the fact that we go through these cycles where a lot of people lose their jobs. That's just part of how free market capitalism works, And so there's that insecurity that comes from that. We have the insecurity that's come from neoliberal philosophy, which says what we need to do is to cut public government as much as possible. Well, what that means is cutting that underlying safety net, and that leads people to feel insecure too. So, consumer capitalism is a good example of where we can see both the social modeling and the insecurity leading people to focus more on materialism. And it seems to work because, again, the research shows that the more that you have a nation which is oriented around free market competitive capitalism, the more materialistic your populace. From doing research on values is that values exist within a value system. That is, and this goes back to a guy named Milton Rokeach, who said when he was first studying values, we can't talk about any value in isolation from other values. Values exist in people's minds in a system, and this makes sense. I mean, when you think about it, when you're making a decision about what to do next, you have to weigh this value against that value, and ultimately, if all other things are equal, you say to yourself, okay, well, this is more important to me, so I'm going to do that, okay? Now, one of the things we know, too, from the work Shalom Schwartz has done, as well as work that I've done with my colleague Fred Grousset, is that values are organized in relatively consistent ways across cultures in people's minds. So value systems work in a way where some values turn out to be psychologically consistent with each other, and other values are in opposition to each other. They stand in conflict. And we're able to show this with a variety of different statistical analyses when we ask people what's important to them. So for example, two values which are psychologically quite consistent with each other are the value for financial success and the value for image. Okay, and the research shows this. The more people care about money, the more they tend to care about image. The more they care about image, the more they tend to care about money. And that makes sense that they're consistent with each other. Now, what we know, though, is that there are also values which stand in opposition to each other. Just to give one kind of obvious example, the research shows that the value of spirituality tends to be in opposition to the value of hedonism. That makes a lot of sense, right? That's why most spiritual traditions say you have to give up the pleasures of the flesh and all that sort of stuff. Now, what we know from this research is that the values, those extrinsic materialistic values, tend to stand in opposition to the values that we call the intrinsic values. Now, we call these the intrinsic values because from our theoretical viewpoint, these are the values which are intrinsically satisfying to pursue because they have to do with basic needs, psychological needs that all people have. And they're those values and needs that have a lot to do with that growth motive we were talking about earlier in the interview. They're the values that tend to promote that movement towards growth. And the three main intrinsic values that we've studied are values for self-acceptance, for affiliation, and for community feeling. Now, what self-acceptance is the desire or the value to know who I am, to like myself, to follow what I'm interested in, to choose what I'm going to do. Okay, so to kind of be who I'm going to be and to like who I am. The value for affiliation is the value to have close relationships with other people, with friends, with family, with lovers, etc. And then the value for community feeling is the value to give back something to the broader world. So not necessarily help your brother or your mother, but to help the broader world, people in your neighborhood, polar bears, people who live in some other country, whatever, to contribute something to the broader community. Now, what we know from the research is that those intrinsic values stand in opposition to the materialistic values. So if you activate in people's minds those materialistic values, what you see is a suppression of the intrinsic values. Conversely, to the extent that you can promote those intrinsic values, what you start to see is a suppression of the materialistic values. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. You can either be greedy or you can be generous. It's tough to be them both at the same moment, right? Okay? If you can promote the generosity, you're going to suppress the greed. If you promote the greed, you're going to suppress the generosity. So from my viewpoint, what we need really, and what's best for being a human, is to live in environments where those intrinsic values are promoted and encouraged and made able to be enacted. And then what you can start to have is people focusing on those intrinsic values, and sort of almost by necessity with the way that the mind is structured, you'll start to see less and less focus on those materialistic values. The conversation we can have is conditioned by the values that we believe are important to us.
Right.
And you're absolutely right that if we turn some away from materialism, we may have less economic growth and be less competitive in the world. But let's recognize that question for what it is, and let's recognize also what the costs are to ourselves and to the world with focusing on the economic growth. And I don't know if you know about the UNICEF Innocenti report that was released a couple of years ago. UNICEF, of course, is the UN group focused on children's well-being, and usually you think of UNICEF as focusing on dirty water for people in poor kids in poor countries. Well, UNICEF released this report that rank ordered the well-being of children in the 21 wealthiest nations in the world, and you know where the United States scored? Number 20. The United Kingdom was 21st. Okay, we were second to last in terms of children's well-being. Now, the study that I have coming out shows that among those 21 nations which are more focused on materialistic values have children with lower well-being. And nations which are more focused on or are less focused on materialistic values and more focused on what we call the intrinsic values, their children are doing better. They're happier, they're healthier. And what we're making the choice for in the United States right now is for profit and economic growth. And who's suffering? Our children are suffering. Our policies and our institutions and our ideologies and the laws we passed are highly weighted towards maximizing profit, towards maximizing consumerism. About 70% of the GDP in the United States, at least before the recession, depended directly upon consumer spending. Okay, directly upon consumer spending, and that's what mostly the government is focused on trying to maximize. There's a cost to that, and that's what that research on how values are organized in people's minds shows. To the extent that you keep thinking what's important is money and possessions and wealth and economic growth, that's going to lead you to care less about things like the good of the whole community, i.e. the good of somebody else's kid. There's three main areas of research that have looked at what is associated with strongly endorsing materialistic values, and there's a growing fourth one. So the first place where there's the most data has to do with materialism and people's well-being. And so what the research has shown, and by now dozens and dozens of studies, is that the more that people endorse materialistic values, the less happy they are. And that goes back to the study I was saying that we published when I was in graduate school. That was one of the first pieces of evidence showing that. And since it's been replicated over and over in different cultures, with children, with adolescents, with adults, with all different kinds of ways of thinking about well-being, from depression and anxiety to self-esteem and drug use, all kinds of different things. And what we know is that the more people endorse values for making a lot of money and having a lot of possessions, the more depressed they are, the more anxious they are, the more they report symptoms of physical problems like headaches and stomach aches, the less satisfied they are with their life, the lower their self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first set of problems. The second set of problems has to do with people's social and interpersonal relationships. So as we were just sort of talking, our materialistic values lead us to treat other people in certain ways. And those ways tend not to be optimal. So we know, for example, that materialistic individuals are less empathic. They care less about how they view other people's inner states. They tend to, when given a choice between being cooperative or being competitive, they choose being competitive, which of course leads them to do well, but oftentimes leads somebody else not to do so well. They also tend to score higher in measures of what's called Machiavellianism. So if you remember Machiavelli's book, The Prince, which is basically a manual for how to obtain power and keep it, materialistic people are likely to endorse those Machiavellian manipulative kind of tendencies. So basically, and they're less pro-social, they cheat more, they steal more, they're less ethical in their business behavior. It's what the research on the social aspects of materialism show. Ecologically, what we know is that the more people endorse materialistic values, the less they tend to care about the environment, the more likely they are to engage in behaviors which damage the environment, and the less likely they are to engage in behaviors that help the environment. And that research has been shown with children as well. So those are the three main places where we have good, solid bodies of evidence showing the problems of materialism. There's just a tiny bit of evidence which is starting to come forth nowadays showing that among adolescents, materialism is also associated with worse school performance. And part of the reason for this seems to be that what happens is that when you're materialistic and you're having to learn something, you focus just on, okay, what am I going to get out of learning this? I'm going to learn it just enough in order to do well on this next test, to get what I need exactly, which is the A, okay? And the A is a kid's paycheck, right?
Right.
Okay. It's sort of the beginnings of materialism. And instead of learning for the love of learning, to grow, okay, the intrinsic motivation. And so, while a materialistic kid probably will do as well on a multiple choice rote memory kind of test as will a kid who's less materialistic. It's when you ask them to engage in these more creative, deeper kinds of learning, that's where you start to see the problems of materialism come about in terms of school performance as well. So those are the main areas where materialism seems to be problematic, and that covers a fairly big swath of life. What it does is it distracts us from growth and pro-social and connection, and instead it focuses on our own desires. And sure.
I'd like to know what your thoughts are on redirecting the culture.
Yeah. Well, for me, it goes back to the two main, to two underlying strategies, okay? The first strategy is that what we have to do is we have to understand what the causes of materialism are and remove those causes. It's basically a public health approach almost, right? What causes cholera? Find it out, get rid of the cause, okay? What causes materialism? Find that out, remove those causes. And as we said earlier in the interview, the two main things we know that lead to materialism are social modeling and insecurity. And so what we need to do in our family lives, in our school lives, in our neighborhoods, and then broadly at the cultural level is to identify the places where people, and children in particular, are A, being exposed to social models which encourage materialism, or
which
B,
we see everywhere.
Which almost is everywhere now, right? And
yeah.
And B, understand what's leading people to feel psychologically insecure, which is almost everywhere too, and help people decrease their exposure to those noxious elements which are known to cause materialism. So that's part A of the strategy. That's the first set of strategies, okay, philosophically. I'll talk practically in a second. The second set of strategies goes back to the way values are organized in people's minds. So recall that values for materialism and extrinsic goals tend to stand in opposition to values, those intrinsic values for community feeling and self-acceptance and affiliation. What we know is that to the extent we can encourage those intrinsic values, it's almost like a seesaw. As those start to go up, what's going to happen is that the materialistic values are going to go down. It's kind of an inoculation almost too, okay, where you're giving somebody which is some values which are going to protect them from those more problematic materialistic values. So those are the two main sources of the strategy for me. Encourage intrinsic values, find the causes of materialism, and remove them. Okay. Now, what does that mean practically? One of the things, first off, if mothers are listening here, let's just talk about maybe what mothers can do. All right. I think that one of the things mothers can do is to take a look at what's happening in their own homes. First, what are the models that the child is being exposed to? Are they models of materialism? Are they models of those intrinsic values? And I think that moms need to take a good hard look at themselves too, okay? So maybe a mom might say that what's most important is volunteering, but on a Saturday she's at the mall instead of at the soup kitchen, okay? Or she's, working 60 hours a week to pay for a nice car and a big house. That sends the kid a very clear message about what's important, okay? Now, I know that there are a lot of moms out there, particularly single, poorer moms, who have to work a lot because of the social system that we're in, and that's what they need because they're feeling psychologically insecure, okay? I understand that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that sometimes people are working for those materialistic aims, okay? And so it's a parent's responsibility, and I'll speak here as a father too, it's a parent's responsibility to look at our own behavior and say, what is my child learning about what's important from watching me? Not from listening to me, but from watching me, from watching what I do, and to try to make those changes. I think another thing we have to take a look at is parental styles. Again, we know from several studies now that a warm, nurturing style tends to promote those intrinsic values and suppress the materialistic values. And I think that's because it helps promote those growth motives, that growth side of what it means to be a human. And so looking at how we treat our children and how we parent our children, and including how we discipline our children, I think becomes very important in terms of helping that child orient towards the growth-oriented side of himself or herself. That's going to help move those intrinsic values along. I think that moms can take a good look at what's happening in their neighborhoods and in their schools. So, for example, and what kind of messages are children being exposed to as they go through their lives? A child might have to walk to school past all kinds of billboards that are promoting materialistic values, might end up at a school where there's commercials in the hallways and in the textbooks, and where the kid is watching Channel 1, where they're seeing television shows with advertisements while they're sitting in their classroom, etc. Here's a place where moms can and parents can fight back and say, we don't want our kids exposed to this. This isn't what we signed up for when we sent our kids to school. We need our children to be protected from these messages. And of course, I failed to mention protection in the own home, of removing a lot of those materialistic messages, that come in via TV and come in via the internet.
All that technology.
Yeah. All that technology. I think if parents aren't aware of the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for media use for their children, I really would encourage them to become aware of those, because they say things like no screen time for children under 2. No television in any child's bedroom, and I'm sure probably nowadays they would say no internet in any child's bedroom. Very restricted amount of screen time for children as they age as well. Most parents, it turns out, are not aware of those AAP guidelines, and I have to fault in part the pediatricians who don't tell their parents, don't tell their patients this. I think it'd be really interesting for a bunch of moms to start asking their pediatricians, why haven't you told me about these guidelines? And that gets at the next thing I really want to say that I think, parents need to do. The world is, as currently structured under corporate capitalism, is not oriented towards protecting children. It's oriented towards making a profit. Now, the CEO of some big company is not going to watch out for your kid. And the politicians who largely got elected by the funds that came from big corporations and from, on the whole, relatively wealthy people, on the whole, are not doing a whole lot to watch out for their kid, for your kid. And so it becomes parents', I think, responsibility to act at a broader social, political level in order to help protect their child. Can do everything you want in the home, but unless you're going to lock your kid up in this house, they're going to be exposed to this toxic culture. And we need to let our kids out into the world. We need to let them start to experience the world, but we need to start to work to change the world in order to make it a safer place for our kids to be. And I also would say that by working at this political level, parents are modeling those community feeling values to their child too. Okay, they're showing the child, hey, what's important is me going out here and working to try to change the world so it's a better place.
Right, and it's saying that the emperor has no clothes. This world is not acceptable.
That's right.
Otherwise, we're just saying, this is good enough for you, kid.
Yeah, and I think parents have to confront that at all possibilities. Since my kids were old enough to talk, I have a wonderful memory of when my younger son Dustin was 1.5 years old. I used to show them National Geographic. And National Geographic is great because it's got beautiful pictures, obviously, but its ads are limited to the back and the front of the magazine. So we would flip through the magazine, and as we would flip through the page, I'd say, ad, ad. And he'd say, what's an ad, Daddy? And I'd say, there's just one thing you need to know about an ad. They want your money. It's all you need to know, okay? That's our responsibility as parents. And I've had people say to me, well, you're brainwashing your kid. And I've said back, well, they're brainwashing my kid too. I'm just trying to fight back.
Yep.
So, parents have to take that on. We have to take on the culture. We have to take on the culture as it comes into our own homes, but then we need to take on the culture directly and politically and push our politicians to do the right thing and push corporations to change their noxious practices. Keeping this strategy in mind is really helpful, because when you're overwhelmed, what you need is a simple solution.